So, looking at our lesson question, why did the Allies choose a Europe first strategy and how did they defeat Germany? Well, as you learned in the warm-up, the United States entered a global war in two major theaters. First, we'll discuss why the United States and its allies decided on a Europe first strategy. Then, you'll learn the approach the Allies took to defeating German forces in Europe. Finally, we'll examine the course of the fighting in the European theater, including the turning points of the war. But first, let's look at the military situation as it existed when the United States entered the war. You should review the two sides involved in World War II. After the entry of the United States, 7 major powers were fighting in the war. The Axis powers included 3 nations: Germany, Italy, and Japan. In January 1942, the Allies consisted of 4 major powers: Great Britain, the Soviet Union, the United States, and China. France was also a major ally, but French forces had surrendered to Germany and the country remained occupied in 1942. In June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, a huge German army invaded the Soviet Union. So we have Germany here invading the Soviet Union there. Hitler's troops advanced quickly, nearly capturing Moscow before the harsh winter halted their offensive. As the spring of 1942 approached, German forces still threatened to knock the Soviets out of the war. Meanwhile, the Afrika Korps, commanded by Erwin Rommel, pushed British troops east into Egypt. There, Rommel hoped to capture the Suez Canal and cut a major Allied supply route. In the Pacific theater, Japanese forces held Southeast Asia and invaded the East Indies. Overall, the situation did not look good for the Allies early in 1942. Soon after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt and Churchill met in Washington, D.C., where they made a key decision. Roosevelt and Churchill decided to send the majority of resources to Europe. In January 1942, German forces threatened Great Britain and the Soviet Union, the only remaining non-neutral, unconquered countries. Great Britain was also America's closest ally. Also, there was concern that Germany was developing an atomic bomb. And some members of the US military opposed the strategy. Japan's advance across the Pacific could not be ignored. And Douglas MacArthur, for example, called for more resources to be sent to the Pacific. Looking at our lesson question, why did the Allies choose a Europe first strategy and how did they defeat Germany? You now know that Allied leaders Churchill and FDR believed the Nazis were a greater threat, so they decided on a Europe first strategy. Now, let's look at how the United States and its allies settled on and carried out the Europe first strategy. Churchill and Roosevelt also had to decide where in the European theater to focus their efforts. Soviet leader Stalin wanted the United States and Britain to invade France and force the Germans to fight on 2 fronts. So here's Germany. We'd fight in France there and Russia there. In 1942, the Germans were focused on the USSR. An invasion in France would have forced the Nazis to split their forces. Churchill feared that a French invasion would fail. He also worried that Axis forces might cut off vital access to oil in North Africa. Churchill and Roosevelt made plans to invade North Africa. So invading North Africa through Morocco, then going on to Algeria, Tunisia, leapfrogging to Sicily, and then to Italy. But first, President Roosevelt had to choose a military commander. Together with George Marshall, he chose Dwight D. Eisenhower, who in 1941 had impressed Marshall, the leader of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with his role in planning troop maneuvers during war games involving 500,000 soldiers. Eisenhower was promoted to captain during the First World War and later served in the Panama Canal Zone and the Philippines. He later was selected as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Eisenhower was well liked and gifted at resolving conflicts between the various generals of the national armies. Remember that Roosevelt and Churchill had decided to invade North Africa. The battle for North Africa began in the fall of 1942. In October 1942, British forces under Bernard Montgomery defeated Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps at the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt. Montgomery's 8th Army then pushed Axis troops west across Libya. So we're going from Egypt across Libya. Days later, 110,000 U.S. and British soldiers landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch. Eisenhower's Anglo-American force advanced east. Axis forces retreated to Tunisia, where they faced Allied armies on both sides. So here's Montgomery's, and now we have Tunisia stuck in the middle. Axis forces surrendered in May 1943. And that allowed Allied leaders to set their sights on Sicily. The Allies began the project of liberating Europe with their invasion and conquest of North Africa. Next up was an invasion of Sicily. The goal was to knock Italy out of the war. U.S. and British forces landed on Sicily on July 10, 1943. Bernard Montgomery led the British troops. George Patton and Omar Bradley led the U.S. troops. As Allied forces advanced across the island, Benito Mussolini was removed from power in Italy. Allied armies controlled the entire island by mid-August. It took little more than a month to conquer Sicily. Next, the Allied forces were then free to move into Italy. General George Patton gained fame during World War II as Eisenhower's most effective and controversial battlefield commander. He commanded the U.S. 7th Army during the liberation of Sicily. That campaign followed Patton's success in leading U.S. troops in North Africa. Although many admired his tough demeanor and actions during the war, Patton was criticized for slapping one of his own soldiers who had been hospitalized for shell shock in Sicily. Shell shock is what we think of as PTSD. A year later, Patton led the U.S. Third Army in a rapid drive across France and Germany that hastened the collapse of the Third Reich. So, why did the Allies choose a Europe-first strategy, and how did they defeat Germany? Well, despite the Soviets' objections, the Allies decided not to invade France right away. Instead, they successfully defeated Nazi forces in North Africa and then invaded Italy. Now, let's look at the Allied invasion of France and the turning points of the war. Unable to invade France, the Allies started their pre-invasion campaign by bombing Germany from the air. British and U.S. leaders intensified their campaign as the war progressed to appease Stalin, who was still impatient for a second front. British and U.S. aerial forces launched bombing raids against German cities, factories, and military targets. Allied bombers dropped 2.7 million tons of explosives on Axis targets in Europe. The Allies lost 160,000 aviators to German fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Eventually, however, the Allies gained air superiority. By the final months of the war, most German factories and cities had been reduced to rubble, and German ability to make war supplies diminished. While the British and U.S. forces were fighting in Italy, the Soviets were trying to repel a Nazi invasion of the USSR. They were locked in a battle over control of Stalingrad, a strategically located city on the Volga River. Here's Stalingrad right here. German and Soviet soldiers fought over the city for nearly 8 months. And following a major drive in the summer of 1942, German soldiers had captured most of Stalingrad by October. Soviet troops then launched counteroffensives from the north and south. So we have this and this. And we'll notice that this little tiny pocket here was surrounded. By February 1943, the German forces at Stalingrad had to surrender. Axis forces suffered 800,000 casualties during this battle. And the Battle of Stalingrad was a major turning point in World War II. It turned the tide of the Eastern Front. And you can see here where Germany had been pushed back. The Allied victories in North Africa and Sicily and the Soviet victory at Stalingrad had turned the tide of the war against the Axis forces in 1943. The Soviet army was moving west toward Germany. In September 1943, U.S. and British armies invaded the Italian mainland. Italy immediately surrendered to the Allies, leaving German troops to defend the Italian peninsula without any help from their former ally. Meanwhile, Eisenhower built up his forces in England, preparing for a cross-channel invasion of France. By the end of 1943, the Allies clearly held the upper hand in Europe. The Allies in 1943 were fighting the ongoing Battle of the Atlantic. U.S. factories produced staggering numbers of aircraft, ships, and other war materials, but the war materials had to be shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, preying on Allied supply ships. In 1942 alone, German submarines sank over 6 million tons of shipping. The Allies implemented improved anti-submarine tactics and technology to reduce ship losses. And by 1944, Allied naval forces controlled the Atlantic. Winning the Battle of the Atlantic allowed plans for the invasion of France to go forward. By the summer of 1944, the Allies were ready to launch their invasion of France. They called the invasion Operation Overlord. The long-awaited attack was launched on June 6, 1944, a date known as D-Day. Allied planners chose the beaches of Normandy as the location for their invasion. The invasion force included 3,000 ships, 3,000 landing craft, and 13,000 planes. The Normandy landings were the largest amphibious attack in history. 156,000 troops went ashore. Allied forces gained the element of surprise because Germany was expecting the attack at Calais, and had positioned their forces to defend that site. The Allies had deftly convinced the Germans that the attack would be made at that site. Deceptive radio transmissions were sent, and General Patton was placed in command of a large, fictitious force that even included dummy ships moored across the channel from Calais to trick the Nazi commanders. After landing in France, Allied troops fought to secure a foothold in Normandy. The invasion force landed at 5 different beaches in Normandy. That's right here. Allied soldiers quickly captured Sword, Gold, Juno, and Utah beaches. U.S. troops landing at Omaha Beach, however, faced heavy resistance from German machine gunners. The Allies eventually secured all 5 beaches and within 5 days managed to land more than 325,000 troops and 54,000 vehicles. The casualty rates were high, however. About 12,000 Allied soldiers were killed or wounded on D-Day. 2,500 U.S. soldiers died. The soldiers who jumped with parachutes behind enemy lines had the highest casualty rates. More than 10% of the U.S. paratroopers were killed or injured in the assault. Within a month of D-Day, 1 million Allied soldiers had landed at Normandy for the campaign to secure northern France, which lasted more than a month. It's difficult to know how many soldiers were killed or wounded, but historians estimate that Germans suffered 320,000 casualties during the Normandy campaign, while Allied casualties numbered 220,000. About 9,300 U.S. soldiers are buried in European cemeteries as a result of the Battle of Normandy. Despite enduring many setbacks in 1944, Germany was not yet defeated. As Allied forces moved eastward toward Germany, German commanders launched an offensive in December 1944. They attacked Allied forces in the Ardennes forest in France, hoping to drive a wedge into the Allied assault. The German forces successfully advanced 65 miles. Allied forces under British General Montgomery and U.S. General Patton struck back at the Germans from the north and south. British and U.S. troops forced the Germans to retreat with heavy losses. This became known as the Battle of the Bulge. The battle ended Hitler's hope for winning the war. Casualties were heavy. U.S. forces suffered about 90,000 casualties. 19,000 U.S. soldiers were killed. The Battle of the Bulge was the final turning point in the war. At the start of 1945, victory in Europe was close at hand. In January, the Soviet Army launched a massive offensive on the Eastern Front. Soviet troops and tanks advanced west through Poland and into Germany. The Soviets' Red Army captured the German capital of Berlin on May 2, 1945. And with defeat inevitable, Hitler committed suicide. By May 8, 1945, all German units had surrendered. The war in Europe was over.